I have a report outlining the village's financial response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The presentation will take several minutes and will cover the 7 topics shown here on the screen. I will start with an overview of the issue as it relates to the village's budget and financial condition. Simply put, the COVID-19 pandemic is significantly negatively impacting the national, regional, and local economy. Accordingly, many village revenue sources will be negatively affected. At the same time, expenses related to responding to the pandemic are projected to increase. We have identified several goals and objectives to be achieved in our financial response plan. Our goal is to be a sustainable and resilient village government. Our objectives are to continue to provide essential services during the crisis throughout 2020 and into the future. We also need to be financially prepared to respond to a future emergency or disaster. These goals and objectives are consistent with our strategic goal of being a steward of financial sustainability. Additional objectives in the plan include using a multiple fund response. The general fund may not be in a position to respond effectively without the resources of other funds. Maintaining robust balances in the health and risk fund in anticipation of an increase in claims and therefore costs. Aligning the village's response with the timing and magnitude of the issue, as well as the approaches being used by the state and federal governments. And finally, maintaining at least half of the reserves in the general fund so that we could respond to future emergencies or disasters. The COVID-19 pandemic and its economic impacts present many challenges to be addressed. There is a great deal of uncertainty about the duration and the impact of the pandemic on the local economy. No one can predict for sure how long and to what extent the economy will be affected. Based on the information available now, the magnitude of the potential decline in village revenues could be overwhelming. Another challenge is the lag time in the reporting of many of the village's major revenue sources. For example, there is a 90-day lag in the reporting and remittance of sales tax revenues. There's also uncertainty about financial assistance available to municipalities from the federal and state governments. It's important to note that financial assistance is not guaranteed for municipalities with populations less than 500,000. A key step in responding to the issue is quantifying the financial impact. Here's some background information about the general fund, the village's primary operating fund, which is used to pay for most village services. The general fund is supported by a wide mix of revenue sources, shown here in the green portion of the bar chart. Total revenue for 2020 is budgeted to be just shy of $50 million. Over half of these revenues are greatly influenced by economic activity. Over $27 million of the budgeted revenue comes from sales tax, food and beverage taxes, income taxes, and building permit fees. The current economic downturn is expected to substantially reduce these revenues. Looking at the general fund expenses by operating department, shown in the red bar on the chart, about 82% of total expenses are used to operate the police, fire, and public works departments. These departments provide most of the services considered to be essential, including public safety, emergency storm response, and snow and ice control. The general fund maintains the recommended level of reserves, equal to 40% of annual expenses. We currently have about $20 million in reserve. A significant decline in the economically sensitive revenues while maintaining essential services could put a large strain on the general fund, even as reserves are used to cover this revenue decline. Staff used a range of revenue projections in the preparation of this response plan. The most conservative revenue projections are shown in this slide and show most revenue sources declining by 50% or more, and property taxes declining by 25%. The most conservative revenue declines can be described as catastrophic or unprecedented. We hope that these projections are too conservative. We pray that the village won't experience this level of crisis. We hope that the projections shown in this slide are wrong. However, if the current economic conditions persist, these revenue declines are possible. Therefore, it is imperative that the village exercise exceptional financial stewardship by preparing for an extended economic downturn. Applying the most conservative revenue projections, total general fund revenues would decline by about 42% in 2020. This would result in a $20.7 million financial gap. The financial plan also includes less conservative revenue projections that would result in a smaller financial gap to be overcome. This slide also shows a 17% decline in total revenues, resulting in an $8.3 million gap. When we discuss strategies and actions later in the presentation, we will show how these gaps could be addressed and will display this slide again. The village has many other funds beyond the general fund, and staff is projecting similar revenue declines in most other funds as well. The 4 funds directly related to and supported by the general fund are likely to be negatively impacted. The funds used for the construction of capital projects, which rely on revenues such as home rule sales tax, utility taxes, stormwater, water, and parking fees, will also be negatively impacted. Additional information about these funds can be found in the revised fund budgets included in the agenda materials for this report. This section of the presentation outlines the actions the village plans on taking to address the financial gap created by the projected revenue decline. The plan calls for a multi-tiered approach. This approach allows the village to scale our financial response as the situation unfolds. We will progress through the tiers as the crisis persists and the conditions dictate. Here is the planned 4-tier response to the projected financial gap in the general fund. Nearly $21 million is available in this tiered response plan. While the tiers appear in order of the planned use, financial conditions may prompt the village to use a mix of all the tiers to respond to the crisis. As a first step, the village will seek reimbursement and financial assistance from the federal and state governments using all legislation and programs available to us. It is important to note that the funding for local governments in the federal stimulus package does not provide for guaranteed direct funding to municipalities with populations less than 500,000. This means that the village of Downers Grove is not guaranteed to receive financial support. We will vigorously pursue such funding. However, at this point, our response plan does not count on receiving funds in this category. Tier 2 includes over $1.8 million in expense reductions by implementing items like a hiring freeze, eliminating all but the most essential purchases of supplies, equipment, and vehicles, and eliminating staff travel and training and educational reimbursements. Tier 3 includes deferring the construction of capital projects in the capital fund, in the municipal buildings funds, and transferring these funds on hand intended to pay for these projects into the general fund to help cover operational expenses. About $6.5 million could be transferred into the general fund with this approach. Capital projects in these 2 funds were suspended a few weeks ago and will continue to be suspended until revenues return to originally budgeted performance levels. The village is actively implementing the first 3 tiers right now. Tier 4 includes using money from the Asset Forfeiture Fund and up to half of the general fund reserves. About $12.4 million is available in this tier. The village is positioned to implement Tier 4 actions immediately, should circumstances dictate. Again, while the tiers appear in order of planned use, financial conditions may prompt the village to use a mix of all tiers to respond to the crisis. Here's the graph of potential revenue decline and the resulting financial gap shown earlier in this presentation. We will demonstrate how the actions in the tiered approach can be used to address the gaps. The actions included in Tiers 2 and 3 can be used to address a 17% decline in revenues, a gap of $8.3 million. Applying all of the 4 tiers would allow the village to address a 42% decline, a gap of $20.7 million. Monitoring the performance of all village revenues is key to the successful implementation of this plan. During the next 3 weeks, we will receive information about 5 key revenue sources budgeted to generate $1.68 million. By April 30th, we should have a better understanding of the likely impact to the village budget. However, additional key information will not be available until summer. Deciding when to implement the actions in the tiers and to what extent will be challenging given the significant delay in receiving information about revenue performance. The availability of federal and state funds will not likely be known until May 1st. Property tax revenue will not be available until June. April sales tax revenue will not be available until middle of July. Decisions about all potential action steps will take place throughout the balance of the year. Every attempt will be made to align the responsive action steps with the duration and magnitude of this crisis. On or around the first day of each month for the next 3 months, decisions about the implementation of this response plan will be made. Each month we'll have a little bit more information about our overall financial condition. The revenue decline included in this financial plan is conservative, and the tiered approach allows the village to align the response with the magnitude of the issue. However, it is conceivable that the financial conditions may prompt the village to take actions beyond those included in the 4 tiers. If this turns out to be the case, the village could consider using reserves in the enterprise funds, these are the water and parking funds. Capital projects in these funds have been suspended as well to preserve available cash in these funds. Considering the early retirement of the Ogden Avenue Tax Increment Financing District and using the disbursement of funds for general operations. And finally, considering steps which would reduce personnel expenses. It is important to understand that the village's projected financial condition if all of the 4 tiers of the response plan are implemented. The ending balance in many funds will be affected with this response plan. This table shows the results of using all 4 tiers. In this scenario, the balances in these 4 funds would decline by $16 million in total due to the use of reserves and the projected revenue decline in each fund. Capital projects will be limited to only a few essential projects. The projects which started prior to the emergency declaration and the projects funded by grants and bond proceeds. Here are the next steps as we implement this plan. First, we will continue to monitor all village revenues. We will continue to seek assistance from the state and federal governments if funding is made available. We will continue to reduce general fund expenses with a commitment to cost control. We will continue with the suspension of capital projects in all funds, and we will prepare for the use of the Tier 4 action items. We will also continuously report information out to the Village Council and to the public. Thank you.